The courtroom fell into a silence so profound you could hear the scratch of the stenographer's pen across paper. All eyes fixed on the small figure behind the witness stand. A pale, thin girl, no more than 8, her feet dangling inches above the floor. Emma Bailey wore a faded yellow dress, the kind meant for Sundays or special occasions. Though there was nothing celebratory about today, her hands clutched a threadbare stuffed rabbit, knuckles white with tension. But it wasn't the child who caused Judge Robert Sullivan to remove his glasses slowly, his weathered face tightening with concern. It was the German shepherd sitting perfectly still in the center aisle, its intelligent eyes never leaving the girl. When Emma's small hand moved almost imperceptibly, a tiny circular motion with her pinky finger, the dog's posture changed instantly. The bailiff stepped forward, but froze when the animal approached the witness stand with military precision and turned to face the courtroom. Emma's trembling fingers tapped twice against her chest. The dog barked once, a sharp, authoritative sound that cracked through the chamber like a gunshot. Judge Sullivan's gavel slipped from his fingers, clattering against wood as the color drained from his face. He'd presided over 3 decades of testimonies, but nothing had prepared him for what he was witnessing: a child who hadn't spoken a word in 18 months, now telling her truth through signals that no one in the room had anticipated. No one, except the uniformed police officer, whose face had transformed from confident smile to mask of barely contained fury. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Millfield had once been a postcard-perfect American town with its white church steeple piercing blue skies and Main Street shops where folks greeted each other by name. But the devastating floods 9 months ago had washed away that Norman Rockwell facade, leaving weathered buildings, mud-stained streets, and a community divided by more than just the swollen river that cut through its heart. The town courthouse, an imposing colonial structure that had survived both the flood and a century of Millfield history, now served as the backdrop for the most contentious custody battle the county had seen in decades. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators clearly divided. The left side filled with uniformed police officers, their badges gleaming in solidarity with one of their own. The right populated by hospital staff in scrubs who had worked alongside Sarah Bailey through countless emergency room crises. Emma Bailey, small for her 8 years, seemed to fold further into herself with each passing minute. Her honey-blonde hair hung in 2 neat braids, the work of her mother's patient hands. That morning, the yellow dress, once bright now, washed too many times, had been her brave dress, worn to every doctor's appointment since the night that had stolen her voice. Her eyes, deep blue and far too knowing, for a child darted between her mother and the large German shepherd. Sitting attentively nearby, Ranger wasn't an ordinary service dog. His powerful shoulders bore small scars beneath his fur remnants from the day he'd been trapped under debris during flood rescue operations. His training as a police search and rescue dog had been supplemented by newer skills: the ability to detect rising heart rates, subtle muscle tensions, and the almost imperceptible signals of a child in distress. His focused gaze never wandered from Emma. Sarah Bailey sat ramrod straight at the plaintiff's table, her nurse's scrubs traded for a modest blue dress that couldn't hide her exhaustion. At 34, the premature threads of silver in her dark hair told stories her composed face wouldn't reveal. Her hands, capable of threading IVs during emergencies, now trembled slightly as she arranged and rearranged papers before her. Across the aisle sat Officer Marcus Bailey, Millfield Police Department's most decorated officer. His pressed uniform and confident smile projected authority, his eyes constantly scanning the courtroom like he was securing a crime scene. Few would guess this respected first responder was the reason his stepdaughter hadn't spoken a word in 18 months. Judge Robert Sullivan adjusted his reading glasses, studying the file before him. At 62, he'd heard every kind of family dispute, but something about this case troubled him deeply, something beyond the formal complaints and carefully worded affidavits. His gaze lingered on the service dog, an unusual presence in his courtroom, but one he'd reluctantly permitted on Dr. Harper's insistence that the animal was crucial to Emma's well-being. The disaster that struck Millfield came with little warning. The spring rains had been heavier than usual, the river swelling day by day until that terrible Tuesday when the levee finally surrendered. Sarah Bailey had been halfway through her shift at Millfield General when the first flood victims arrived, muddy, desperate, and terrified. For 72 hours straight, she worked tirelessly, catching moments of sleep on gurneys in the hallway, her scrubs stiff with dried mud and sweat. It was during the worst of it that she first met Ranger, then a proud member of the county's K-9 Search and Rescue Unit. The German Shepherd had been brought in with a deep gash across his flank, his handler explaining breathlessly that the dog had refused to abandon a search even after being injured by submerged debris. He found 3 children trapped in an attic, the handler had explained as Sarah cleaned and sutured the wound. Wouldn't leave until all 3 were safe. Sarah remembered looking into those intelligent eyes and wondering what kind of soul lived behind them. 2 weeks later, she learned that Ranger's injuries had ended his official search and rescue career. Something about that news cut through her exhaustion. She made inquiries, filled out paperwork, and brought the recovering dog home to her small apartment where her daughter Emma immediately formed an attachment so strong it seemed fated. Then Marcus Bailey entered their lives. He'd been coordinating police rescue efforts during the flood, a commanding presence in uniform who'd stopped by the hospital to check on rescued victims. His attention quickly shifted to Sarah. He brought her coffee during long shifts, listened to her worries about single parenthood, praised her dedication to her patients. When he asked her to dinner, it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "You're the kind of hero this town needs," he told her on their 3rd date, his smile confident, his hand warm over hers. 6 weeks later, they were married at the courthouse with 7-year-old Emma as their only witness, Ranger sitting obediently beside her. Sarah didn't learn until their honeymoon that Marcus had a previous marriage, a relationship that had ended tragically when his girlfriend took her own life. What he didn't mention was that this woman had been Emma's biological mother, that he had surrendered custody of Emma as an infant, and that Sarah's adoption of Emma years earlier had actually reunited the child with her birth father. These truths would come much later in fragments and whispers. The first sign came 3 months into the marriage, a shattered glass when dinner was late. Then came the criticism of her parenting, the monitoring of her phone calls, the insistence that she cut back her hospital hours. "A child needs her mother at home," he'd say, though his eyes flicked toward Emma with something closer to resentment than concern. The night that silenced Emma came after Sarah worked a double shift. She returned home to find Marcus waiting, his rage simmering beneath a too calm exterior. What began as accusations escalated swiftly. Emma, hearing the commotion, had crept down the stairs just in time to witness Marcus slam Sarah against the kitchen wall, his forearm pressed against her throat. When Emma screamed, his attention turned to her with such fury that something inside the child simply shut down. By the time the neighbors called police fellow officers who immediately believed Marcus's story about Sarah's hysteria, Emma had retreated so deeply into silence that not even the child psychologists at Millfield General could coax out her voice. Recovery came slowly for Sarah, both physically and emotionally. The fractured ribs healed before the fear in her eyes did. 2 weeks in the hospital gave her clarity that had been obscured by Marcus's careful manipulation. With Emma still eerily silent by her bedside, Sarah made the decision that would set everything else in motion. "I'm filing for divorce," she told Dr. Melissa Harper, the pediatric psychologist who had been unsuccessfully working with Emma, "and I'm taking Emma away from him." Dr. Harper's expression had been grave. "You know who you're up against. Sarah Marcus Bailey isn't just any husband. He's Millfield's favorite son right now." Indeed, while Sarah had been recovering, Marcus had been building his defense. The local newspaper ran a feature on the heroic officer who'd saved so many during the floods, now standing strong while his wife suffered what he described as a mental health crisis. Photos showed him bringing Emma to school, a portrait of dedicated fatherhood that hid the truth of what happened behind closed doors. "I don't care," Sarah had whispered, touching her daughter's silent face. "I should have protected her sooner." The legal separation triggered a series of calculated moves from Marcus. First came the concerned calls from his fellow officers, suggesting Sarah think of the department family. Then came the whispers at the hospital, hints that perhaps Sarah's judgment was compromised by stress or medication. Most painful was the custody filing, claiming Sarah was an unfit mother due to emotional instability and excessive work hours. It was Dr. Harper who suggested bringing Ranger back into Emma's therapy sessions. The German Shepherd had been staying with a neighbor during Sarah's hospitalization, and Emma's face showed the first flicker of emotion in weeks when the dog padded into the therapy room. "Animals sometimes reach places in traumatized children that humans can't," Dr. Harper explained, watching Emma bury her face in Ranger's fur. "They offer unconditional acceptance without demanding words." What began as comfort evolved into something more profound. Dr. Harper noticed that Emma would use subtle hand movements to communicate with Ranger and the dog. With his police training still intact, responded with remarkable precision. Together they developed a rudimentary signal system that allowed Emma to express basic needs and emotions without speaking. "She's found a way to communicate that feels safe," Dr. Harper told Sarah during a private consultation. "Marcus can't twist or use her signals against her the way he might with words." Meanwhile, the community Sarah had once considered family fractured along sharp lines. Police officers' wives who had brought casseroles during the flood now crossed the street to avoid her. Nurses who had witnessed her professional dedication now had to choose sides. Supporting her meant risking relationships with law enforcement. Their hospital depended on Marcus's tactics grew more sophisticated. He arranged accidental encounters at Emma's school timed perfectly, so others would witness his affectionate greetings, and Emma's fearful silence, which he attributed to confusion caused by her mother's allegations. The custody evaluator assigned to the case seemed swayed by Marcus's charisma and community standing. His report noted Emma's silence as concerning, but suggested it might be influenced by maternal anxiety. Only Dr. Harper's professional testimony kept Sarah's case alive, insisting that Emma's trauma response was genuine and severe. As the crucial hearing approached, Sarah watched her daughter's silent interactions with Ranger grow more complex. One evening she observed Emma making a series of small hand signals that the dog responded to with incredible precision, sitting retrieving specific items, then positioning himself between Emma and the door in a protective stance. "She's created her own language," Sarah realized with a mixture of heartbreak and awe. She didn't know then how important this silent language would become, or how it would ultimately break open the wall of protection Marcus had built around himself. The courthouse steps became Sarah Bailey's personal Everest each time a preliminary hearing was scheduled. Despite having navigated trauma victims through their worst moments, she found herself struggling to breathe as she guided Emma past the gauntlet of whispers and stares. Marcus had mastered the art of appearing reasonable in public while orchestrating a campaign of isolation behind the scenes. "Just following proper procedure," he would say with practiced concern, when requesting yet another psychological evaluation for Sarah. Each filing, each delay tactic stretched their savings thinner. Sarah had been forced to pick up extra shifts, leaving Emma with a rotating cast of hospital colleagues willing to help. Dr. Harper's office became their sanctuary. The calm blue walls and soft lighting created a space where Emma could work with Ranger without fear of judgment or manipulation. It was during the third month of therapy that Dr. Harper noticed something remarkable about their communication. "She's not just signaling commands," Dr. Harper explained to Sarah after one session. "She's developed a way to express emotions and memories through those signals. Watch how she touches her chest twice before signaling Ranger to stand guard. That's when she's feeling afraid." Sarah witnessed this silent language evolve, becoming increasingly sophisticated. Emma would make a small, circular motion with her pinky. Ranger would retrieve her sketchbook. A double tap near her heart. He would position himself between her and the door. 2 fingers brushed across her palm. He would place his head in her lap, providing deep pressure therapy during moments of anxiety. Ranger was police-trained before his rescue work, Dr. Harper noted. His response to subtle cues is exceptional. It's as though they've developed their own private language. The day Sarah found the drawings beneath Emma's mattress, her world tilted again. Page after page of dark crayon images. A large, shadowy figure, hands around a woman's throat, a small child hiding in corners. On the back of one, Emma had printed in careful letters, "He says I'm his girl, but I'm only safe when he's gone." Sarah brought the drawings to her attorney, a tired woman named Linda Geary, who had taken the case at reduced rates. Linda sighed as she examined them. "Children's drawings are considered subjective evidence, Sarah. Without Emma's testimony explaining them, Marcus's attorney will dismiss them as the product of coaching." "She can't speak about it," Sarah said, desperation edging her voice. "Then we need to find evidence that does speak," Linda replied. What followed was a painstaking reconstruction of the past. Sarah reached out to neighbors who might have heard arguments. Most doors closed in her face. Marcus had cultivated their loyalty too well. She searched for medical records from Emma's biological mother, hoping to establish a pattern, but those files had mysteriously disappeared from county archives. Meanwhile, Marcus's campaign intensified. A formal complaint appeared at the hospital, questioning Sarah's competence during high-stress situations. Though her supervisor dismissed it immediately, the whispers followed her through the corridors. Parents at Emma's school received concerned calls suggesting playdates might be complicated given the unstable home situation. "He's isolating us completely," Sarah confided to Dr. Harper during a tearful session. "It's like he's erasing us in plain sight." Dr. Harper's response was measured. "That's exactly what abusers do, Sarah. They isolate, undermine, and rewrite reality." But Emma's silence isn't working in his favor anymore. It's become evidence itself. What Dr. Harper didn't share immediately was her growing concern about Emma's nightmares. During their sessions, the child had begun drawing scenes of a woman falling or being pushed from heights. when Dr. Harper gently introduced a dollhouse with female figures. Emma's reaction had been visceral. Violently pushing away a doll figure with long, dark hair, similar to her biological mother's. At night, Sarah would hear Emma's whimpers entering her room to find Ranger already there, his body curved protectively around the child, responding to signals Emma made even in her sleep. On the worst nights, Sarah would discover small, concerning marks on Emma's arms. The child had begun pinching herself raw before visits with Marcus, as though physical pain was preferable to those encounters. Linda Geary finally uncovered a potential breakthrough, a police report filed 3 years earlier by Emma's biological mother alleging threats from Marcus. The complaint had been quickly dismissed by fellow officers, but its existence suggested a pattern. More disturbing was discovering that the woman's supposed suicide had occurred just 2 days after filing that report. "We need to tread carefully," Linda warned. Accusing a decorated officer of involvement in a death-ruled suicide years ago could backfire spectacularly without solid evidence. What none of them anticipated was the unexpected ally who emerged from Marcus's ranks. Officer Daniel Winters, a rookie who'd been assigned to Marcus during the flood response, approached Sarah outside the hospital with nervous glances over his shoulder. "I've seen things that don't sit right," he said quietly. "The way he talks about Emma when you're not around, the way he handled a domestic call last month, too personal, too angry. I can't testify officially, but—" He pressed a small thumb drive into her hand. "Dashboard camera footage from patrol cars doesn't always get properly archived." As the custody hearing approached, Dr. Harper made a bold recommendation to the court that Ranger be allowed to accompany Emma during her testimony as a certified therapy animal. Marcus's attorney objected strenuously, calling it theatrical manipulation. But Judge Sullivan, after reviewing Dr. Harper's detailed reports on Emma's communication methods, granted the request. The night before the hearing, Sarah found Emma sitting on her bedroom floor with Ranger practicing their signals with an intensity that broke Sarah's heart. The child's hands moved deliberately, precisely as though rehearsing something crucial. When Emma finally fell asleep, Sarah noticed a folded paper clutched in her small fist. Another drawing, but this one different from the others. This one had purpose. The morning of the custody hearing dawned with a heavy fog that wrapped around Millfield like a shroud. Sarah Bailey arrived at the courthouse an hour early, Emma's hand firmly in hers, Ranger walking precisely at the child's side. The German Shepherd wore his official therapy dog vest, the paperwork authorizing his presence tucked into Sarah's worn leather briefcase alongside evidence gathered over 6 painful months. Inside Courtroom 3, the polished oak pews filled quickly. The division in the town was reflected in the seating. Law enforcement personnel occupied the rows behind Marcus, their faces impassive badges catching the fluorescent light. Behind Sarah sat hospital staff in civilian clothes, Dr. Harper among them, her expression professionally neutral, though her eyes betrayed concern. In the back row sat Officer Daniel Winters, positioned as though uncertain which side claimed his loyalty. Judge Robert Sullivan entered at precisely 9 o'clock, his robes settling around him like armor as he took his seat. At 62, his face carried the deep lines of someone who had seen humanity at its worst and occasionally at its best. He surveyed the crowded courtroom with narrowed eyes, his gaze lingering momentarily on Emma and the German Shepherd at her feet. "I'll remind everyone that these proceedings concern the welfare of a minor child." Sullivan began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades on the bench. "Outbursts will not be tolerated. Emotional displays will result in immediate removal." His eyes flicked toward Marcus, then Sarah, before settling on the court stenographer. "Let's begin." Marcus Bailey sat with perfect posture at the defendant's table, his uniform pressed and medals gleaming. His attorney, James Hargrove, was known throughout the county for representing police officers in disciplinary matters, a slick man with silver temples and a smile that never reached his eyes. They projected a united front of authority and competence. Sarah's testimony came first, a clinical recounting of escalating abuse, carefully edited to focus on documentable incidents. She detailed the night of Emma's trauma in a voice that wavered only once when describing how she'd found her daughter huddled in a closet afterward, eyes vacant, voice gone. Hargrove's cross-examination was brutal in its gentleness, painting Sarah as overworked, overwrought, and possibly delusional. "Mrs. Bailey," he said, the false sympathy in his voice like oil on water, "isn't it possible that your high-stress occupation and the trauma of the flood have colored your perceptions of normal marital disagreements?" Dr. Harper's testimony followed, focusing on Emma's profound trauma response. She explained the communication system developed with Ranger, describing it as an extraordinary adaptation to emotional injury. When questioned about whether Emma had ever directly accused Marcus of abuse, Harper was forced to acknowledge the child could not verbalize any accusation. By mid-afternoon, the mood in the courtroom had grown tense. Judge Sullivan called a 15-minute recess before Emma would be brought in for questioning. Sarah watched Marcus in the hallway, surrounded by uniformed colleagues, his confident smile never faltering as he accepted their reassuring claps on the shoulder. When court resumed, Emma entered, wearing her yellow dress, Ranger walking precisely at her side. The child looked impossibly small. In the witness chair, her feet dangling above the floor, Judge Sullivan had agreed to a modified questioning format. Given Emma's condition, he would ask simple questions requiring only nodded or shaken responses. "Emma," the judge began gently, "do you understand that you're here to help me make an important decision about where you'll live?" The child gave a small nod, her fingers white-knuckled around her stuffed rabbit. "Are you afraid of anyone in this courtroom today?" Emma's eyes darted briefly toward Marcus, then down at her lap. No response. "Does your mother take good care of you?" A quick, definitive nod. "Has anyone ever hurt you or your mother?" Emma's breathing quickened visibly. Ranger, sensing the change in her physiology, shifted slightly at the base of the witness stand, his ears alert. The child made no gesture in response to the question. Judge Sullivan sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. "Emma, I know this is difficult, but I need to understand. What happened next occurred so quickly that later witnesses would disagree on the exact sequence." Emma's right hand moved in a small, deliberate circle. Ranger immediately stood, ears forward, positioned himself facing the courtroom rather than Emma, and sat at perfect attention. Emma tapped her chest twice. The dog barked once, a sharp, authoritative sound that silenced the courtroom instantly. Dr. Harper rose halfway from her seat. "Your Honor, that's her signal, the communication system I testified about." "What does it mean?" Sullivan asked, leaning forward. "The circular motion is her call for attention. The chest tap, followed by a bark, means listen to the truth. It's how she indicates something important needs to be known." The courtroom fell silent as Emma reached into the pocket of her yellow dress and withdrew a folded paper. She held it out with a trembling hand. The bailiff took it gently and delivered it to Judge Sullivan, who unfolded it slowly. The color drained from his face as he studied the crayon drawing. It showed 3 figures: a large man with a badge pushing a dark-haired woman from what appeared to be a high window, while a small child watched from behind a door. On the back, written in careful block letters, "First Mommy didn't jump." Marcus Bailey's face transformed from confident calm to something darker. He half rose from his seat as Judge Sullivan looked up from the drawing, their eyes meeting in a moment of terrible recognition. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Marcus Bailey lunged to his feet, his attorney grabbing his arm in a futile attempt to restrain him. "That's a lie!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "She's been coached. That woman has poisoned my daughter against me." Judge Sullivan's gavel came down with thunderous force. "Order, Officer Bailey, sit down immediately or I will have you removed." The bailiff moved quickly to position himself between Marcus and the witness stand, hand resting on his holster. Emma's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. At the sound of her stepfather's rage, she curled into herself, fingers digging into her forearms where faint bruises were already visible. Ranger responded without command, placing his body between Emma and the courtroom, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Dr. Harper approached the bench, requesting permission to assist the child. As she knelt beside Emma, the psychologist gently uncurled the girl's fingers from her arms, revealing rows of self-inflicted marks. Some fresh, others faded into scars. "Your Honor," Dr. Harper said, her professional composure faltering, "these are consistent with what I attempted to include in my report. Emma has been harming herself before and after visitations with her stepfather. It's a common response when traumatized children feel powerless to escape their abuser." Sarah's sob cut through the tension as she witnessed for the first time the full extent of her daughter's silent suffering. The marks told a story more eloquent than words, neat rows of self-inflicted pain, a child's desperate attempt to control some aspect of her terror. Judge Sullivan ordered the courtroom cleared except for essential personnel. As officers filed out, their expressions ranged from confusion to hardened disbelief. Marcus remained seated, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear, his face a mask of contained rage. When the doors closed, Dr. Harper outlined the full tragedy that had unfolded over months of therapy. She described Emma's nightmares, the violent reactions to any mention of heights or falling, the drawings of a woman plummeting while a man watched. She explained how Emma had developed elaborate rituals of self-harm, pinching her arms until they bruised, pressing fingernails into palms during mandated visits with Marcus, physical pain chosen over the psychological terror of being alone with him. In 20 years of practice, Dr. Harper concluded, "I've never seen a child create such elaborate systems of both communication and self-punishment. Emma doesn't just fear her stepfather, Your Honor. She lives in terror that what happened to her biological mother will happen to Sarah." Sarah's testimony resumed, this time without the audience of Marcus's supporters. She described the night she'd discovered hospital records from 3 years earlier. Emma's biological mother treated for accidental injuries twice in the month before her death. She recounted how Marcus had whispered to her during an argument, "No one believed Jennifer either, and look what happened to her." Officer Daniel Winters was called forward. Visibly nervous, he described overhearing Marcus on the phone warning Sarah that accidents happen to people who don't know when to stay quiet. He admitted to witnessing Marcus manipulate evidence in domestic violence calls, coaching male suspects on what to say, intimidating female victims into recanting. As the testimony continued, Emma remained curled against Ranger, her fingers buried in his fur, her eyes vacant. The child who had survived by shutting down was now witnessing the full unveiling of truths she had carried alone. Each revelation seemed to diminish her further, as though the weight of secrecy had been the only thing keeping her upright. The most devastating moment came when Dr. Harper presented the results of Emma's latest medical examination. X-rays revealed a previously undetected hairline fracture in her left wrist, approximately 2 months old, coinciding with a weekend visitation when Marcus had taken Emma camping. The child had never complained, never sought treatment, had simply absorbed this additional pain into her silent world. Judge Sullivan's face grew increasingly grave as the evidence mounted. When he finally called a recess, his hands trembled slightly as he gathered the papers before him. Medical reports, therapy notes, and a child's crayon drawings that whispered of horrors no 8-year-old should ever witness. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something heavier, a collective holding of breath as Judge Sullivan adjusted his reading glasses and consulted a file that hadn't been present earlier. His weathered face betrayed nothing as he addressed the room. "Before we continue, I need to address new evidence that has come to my attention." He nodded to his clerk, who distributed documents to both attorneys. "These are records from the Westridge County Sheriff's Department concerning the death investigation of Jennifer Lowell 3 years ago." Marcus Bailey's posture stiffened, his attorney quickly scanning the papers with widening eyes. "Your Honor, these records were sealed as part of a closed investigation," Hargrove protested. "They're inadmissible and irrelevant to the current proceedings." "On the contrary," Judge Sullivan replied, his voice unnaturally steady, "as Chief Judge of this district, I requested these files directly after recognizing the address in Emma's drawing. The investigation into Jennifer Lowell's death ruled a suicide, despite concerning inconsistencies occurred at the same apartment complex where Officer Bailey resided prior to his marriage to Mrs. Bailey." The first crack in Marcus's facade appeared a muscle twitching near his jaw, fingers curling into fists on the table before him. "More relevant is that Jennifer Lowell was Emma's biological mother," Sullivan continued, "a fact Officer Bailey deliberately concealed from this court. Ms. Lowell had filed a police report alleging threats from Officer Bailey just 48 hours before her death. That report was dismissed by his supervising officer without investigation." Sarah gasped audibly, pieces clicking into terrible place. Marcus's careful avoidance of any mention of Emma's birth mother, his insistence that adoption paperwork wasn't necessary because the birth parents are out of the picture. The lies had been woven so seamlessly she'd never questioned the inconsistencies. The second revelation came from an unexpected source. The courtroom doors opened to admit Chief Michael Donnelly of the Millfield Police Department, his expression grim as he approached the bench. "Your Honor, in light of information brought to my attention this morning, I felt compelled to provide these records." He handed over a file bearing the Millfield PD insignia. "They concern the training and service history of K-9 Unit 7, registered name Ranger." Emma's head lifted slightly at the mention of her dog's name. Ranger still positioned protectively at her side, ears forward, as if recognizing his designation. "Would you summarize the relevance, Chief Donnelly?" Sullivan asked. "Ranger was originally trained by Officer Marcus Bailey when Bailey served briefly in our K-9 division 3 years ago. The dog was removed from his handling after showing signs of mistreatment and transferred to search and rescue. Officer Bailey was disciplined, but the incident was kept internal." The revelation rippled through the courtroom. The therapy dog who now protected Emma had once been under Marcus's training, had perhaps witnessed his true nature long before anyone else. The final twist came from Judge Sullivan himself. He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose before looking directly at Marcus Bailey. "Officer Bailey, 10 years ago, before my appointment to the bench, I served as a defense attorney in Westridge County. I represented a woman named Claire Hamilton in a domestic assault case. You were the responding officer. You convinced her to recant her statement against her husband, told her she'd lose her children if she pressed charges. Sullivan's voice hardened. She was murdered by that husband 3 months later. A heavy silence fell. Marcus's face had gone completely blank. A void more terrifying than anger. From the witness stand came a sound so unexpected that every head turned a small, raspy voice that hadn't been heard in 18 months. "Ranger knows." Emma said, her fingers buried in the dog's fur. "He remembers the noise when first Mommy fell. He tried to help her." The child's first spoken words fell like stones into still water. She looked directly at Judge Sullivan, her eyes clear and focused for the first time. "Ranger knows who's safe. He always has." The German shepherd remained motionless beside her, his watchful eyes fixed on Marcus Bailey with ancient, unflinching judgment, a silent witness finally given voice through the child he protected. Judge Robert Sullivan's ruling came down like thunder in the hushed courtroom. Full custody awarded to Sarah Bailey with a permanent restraining order against Marcus. As the judge outlined his decision, his voice carried the weight of belated justice, not just for Emma, but for Jennifer Lowell and countless others whose truths had been buried beneath badges and paperwork. The court finds compelling evidence of psychological and physical abuse. Sullivan stated, meeting Marcus's cold stare without flinching. "Furthermore, I am referring Officer Bailey's case to the State Attorney's Office for investigation into the death of Jennifer Lowell." Marcus was led away, his uniform no longer a shield but a mockery of the protection it promised. The reckoning that followed would extend beyond one family, rippling through the police department as Officer Winters and others came forward with long-suppressed testimonies about covered-up complaints and evidence tampering in domestic cases. 6 months passed, like a slow exhale after held breath. The Bailey home, now just Sarah and Emma's, had transformed. Gone were the heavy curtains Marcus had insisted upon, replaced with light-filtering sheers that let sunshine pool across wooden floors. Ranger remained their constant companion, his official therapy dog status now permanent. Emma's words returned gradually like spring after a harsh winter, first in whispers with her mother and Dr. Harper, then in short sentences at school, her voice gaining strength with each passing week. The nightmares lessened, though they never disappeared entirely. Some wounds leave permanent marks, but they no longer defined her. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Emma stood before an assembly at Millfield Elementary, Ranger sitting proudly beside her. "This is my therapy dog," she explained to the gathered children, her voice clear if still soft. "He helped me when I couldn't talk. There are lots of ways to tell your truth, even when you're scared." As the children gathered afterward to pet Ranger, under Emma's careful supervision, Sarah watched from the back of the auditorium alongside Dr. Harper. "She's teaching them what I couldn't teach her," Sarah said quietly, "that they deserve to be heard, that they deserve to be safe." Across town, Judge Sullivan implemented new protocols for handling domestic violence cases in his courtroom, with special provisions for child witnesses. The system that had failed Emma and her mother was changing slowly but irreversibly, because one child had found a way to speak her truth through the most loyal of interpreters. Emma's final drawing, framed in the hallway of their home, showed 3 figures in sunshine: a woman, a child, and a German shepherd. Above them, in careful letters, "Our family knows how to listen now. Sometimes the most profound truths come from the smallest voices. If only we have the wisdom to listen." Emma's story reminds us that courage wears many faces. Sometimes It's a child finding her voice through the loyalty of a dog who recognized what adults couldn't see. For those of us who've lived long enough to witness both the failures and triumphs of our systems, her journey strikes a familiar chord. We remember a time when domestic troubles stayed private matters, when children's testimonies were easily dismissed, when respected uniforms could hide the darkest hearts. But we also remember the power of finally speaking up, of that moment when someone believes you won. Emma and Ranger's bond speaks to something we understand deeply after decades of living, that sometimes our most faithful companions know our truths before we can voice them ourselves. As grandparents, parents, and community elders, we carry a special responsibility to create spaces where children feel safe to tell their stories, even when those stories are difficult to hear. Emma's journey from silence to healing reminds us that it's never too late to listen, never too late for justice, and never too late to rebuild a life filled with sunshine instead of shadows. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.